Good morning, everyone. I'm going to talk to you about a follow-up project that I'm doing after Vanishing Nature. For those of you that have read Vanishing Nature, and I'm sure all of you have, you will know that Vanishing Nature, we addressed the fundamental drivers of biodiversity loss, and we said the reason that decline is continuing is because we're not addressing those underlying economic drivers that mean that conservation is hard and damage is easy. So we went through that over 200 pages, and then we thought about, well, where can we go next? And we decided that there was some real thinking needed at the interface of biodiversity and development, that there were tools and there were solutions that were out there that we could adopt that could get better outcomes, even in the current context, prior to or alongside strategic change. The key problem facing biodiversity is the imbalance between public and private interests. And this is most acute at the interface of biodiversity and development. This is where the opportunities to get better outcomes are not only the clearest, but they're the most urgent. Biodiversity loss is continuing, and in some places of New Zealand it is accelerating. We are not carrying out economic development within environmental limits, and change is needed. In Vanishing Nature we talked about large-scale transformative change, and we talked about change at the operational level. This project focuses on the latter. I'd argue that perfection should not be the enemy of better. There is a lot of rubbish that happens in resource management in New Zealand, and it's to the peril of our natural heritage. There are opportunities to fix things now. I'm going to identify some key issues that I'm finding in this project, which is as yet unnamed in my head. There are key issues that are facing us on the ground for biodiversity, and they are well within our means, and indeed well within our statutory mandates to address. We don't need to wait. One of the key problems I see with biodiversity management and development is that there's a real lack of an end game. There's a lack of strategy, and there's a lack of a decent pathway by which we can get there. We've spent an awful lot of time talking about biodiversity in New Zealand, and the fact that we're still experiencing declines suggests that something is amiss. We have no shortage of agencies, no shortage of legislation. We might have a shortage of experts now, but we definitely have some bods on the ground that can get better outcomes, and they need a way to go. I think New Zealand is facing a bit of a problem with having ambiguous and in some cases absent policy about key issues. There is no guidance on how agencies reconcile their competing mandates. And we have things that fall down gaps, like wetlands and estuaries, which is their natural, of course, ecological place, but it shouldn't be their place in a policy framework. And we have a lack of ways to measure performance by, because we don't know and haven't decided what success really looks like. We have quite a limited array of tools to manage biodiversity. We rely on static and I think somehow quite old-fashioned ways of looking at biodiversity management. I think there are innovations internationally that we haven't taken advantage of. We only need to look to overseas to see that, as Susie said, 400 and something economic instruments in use around the world, even back in 2008. There are tools out there that can help us get very much better outcomes now, at the same time as we advocate for transformative change. It's important that, however, we don't just rush about the world and pick up new tools because they look interesting. They have to be additional. They have to do something that we can't already do, and they have to be proven to be effective, or at least able to be designed such that they are. And the final point, and anybody that knows me knows that I bang on about monitoring all the time, that is not going to end. Outcome-based monitoring in New Zealand remains rare. It remains rare with respect to environmental indicators, but also the efficacy of the instruments by which we try to get good outcomes. Even though we have had a statutory mandate for agencies to monitor the efficiency and effectiveness of their policies and plans for some 20 years, the data is poor. And of course, if you don't know where you've been, and you don't know the difference that it's made, how can you possibly adjust your methods? So we think guesswork on the effectiveness of instruments is imperiling biodiversity even further. So, what do we do about it? This project is a short report that will release an analysis of a number of potential solutions that we could introduce now or shortly in the future. They are used because they have proven effective in other jurisdictions to get better outcomes, because they have merit in particular places in the New Zealand resource management framework. Obviously, there's an awful lot of solutions there, and I can't go through all of them, so I've chosen 5. But you can ask me questions in the breaks about any of the others. One of the important areas of innovation speaks to both the lack of strategy above and the lack of monitoring below. In my view, New Zealand needs to move toward a resilience-based planning framework, and that we should see environmental bottom lines as not the end game, but the midpoint. Because I want to change the conversation from how much do we need to save to how much do we need to harm, and have the default as nature protection. And in order to do that, we need to look through a different lens, from land sparing, as they say, to land sharing. I quote Henrik Moller there. The second area that I think that we need to address is the lack of national guidance. This is a common point of discussion in biodiversity management. It came up at our RMA workshop on Tuesday. It's constantly raised that we just don't have enough guidance to agencies on the matter of biodiversity. And the proposed national policy statement on biodiversity has been thrice drafted and always shelved, and is a good example of the relaxed nature of the commitment to provide guidance on biodiversity. What is the implication of that? The implication is that there's no certainty as to definitions of key things that appear throughout, not only the RMA, but other regimes. Significance. How many people here have been involved in some form of litigation or submission based on significance? I'm sure there's many more than that, be honest. Yeah, there you go. This is a waste of time. It's a waste of time and it's a waste of money. And we have enough of an understanding of what that means from case law to formalise it. About time we got going. The other problem, of course, is that in the absence of guidance to agencies on biodiversity, is that we're all sort of sitting around wondering if they really do have a role, or if the RMA is just joking in section 31 and 32 and 30. The RMA is not joking, that role is there. And yet we are still in the position where regional councils are attempting to decide whether or not they have a role in biodiversity at a national scale. We desperately need guidance from central government to provide not just confirmation of mandate, but some insight as to how councils can do what they do, given the enormous responsibility that is devolved to them. The third area of innovation for New Zealand is actually administratively quite simple. We send out an awful lot of conservation money into an abyss in New Zealand, and we often don't align it with strategic priorities or even the priorities of the organisation that hands it out. And moreover, we often don't monitor the ecological outcomes, which means we're in a position now of having very little understanding of the impact of community conservation on the biodiversity challenge, despite many decades of much work by so many. Reverse conservation tenders are an opportunity to hand out conservation funding for whatever purpose, whether it be agency-led, philanthropic, or for mitigation purposes, to a whole range of users in a very adaptive framework. So just as a very potted explanation, you set your strategic aim for a pot of money, and people bid into it and say, I can deliver these conservation gains for this much. It enables you to maximise the impact of that funding and provides naturally for monitoring underneath. The fourth point I have is conservation enterprise. Graham talked about the need to reinforce the mitigation hierarchy. Every regime overseas that has used the likes of biodiversity offsets has bemoaned the lack of observance of the avoidance step. And as we argue in Vanishing Nature, it's because conservation doesn't make an awful lot of economic sense. And for some people, despite the many passionate people we have in New Zealand, love is not enough. You have to make it work for them. New Zealand urgently needs to to investigate more opportunities for people who have biodiversity, particularly private landowners have biodiversity on their property and they want to make some money from it. There are ways of doing that, and biobanking is one. And I think there is merit in that. The final solution in my whirlwind tour of my next report, keeping in mind these are interim findings, is that protection in New Zealand is all or nothing generally, with the exception of Ngā Whenua Rahui and one or two limited life covenant schemes in district and regional councils. We lack a midpoint at a national level, a more flexible mechanism that can apply to a whole range of different purposes where a covenant in perpetuity is neither arguably necessary or desirable. So I'm looking at what a limited life mechanism might look like in New Zealand and how it is that we can ensure that it is additional rather than resulting in leakage from where perpetual protection is actually much more important. So, in conclusion, transformative change is essential to protect our natural heritage. And you can read all about that in 208 pages of Vanishing Nature. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Theo Stevens for his incredible contribution to that book, all in his own time. Managing my first book, I'm sure, gave him quite a headache. And of course to Raewyn as well for her support, and Bevis Feder, I should say that now. But I don't think that that transformative change should detract from the need to improve practice now and to do everything we can to retard the profound bureaucratic slippage that occurs around biodiversity protection and resource management. I think there are tools that we can take advantage of, and that those new tools will actually help to implement those transformative solutions when we do get there, which hopefully won't be too far away. So this will appear on your desks somewhere as a report in October, November, so I better get to it. And we will have a national roadshow to share the findings and to talk about the diverse array of tools that we think New Zealand could look at adopting, keeping in mind that there are, of course, any number of new tools that we could use. They're everywhere, so I've picked 12 that I think might have legs now, but I'm sure I could do 20 or 30 or whatever, but I don't have time. So just before I go, a big thanks to the EDS team for encouraging me to research everything that I'm passionate about. My interviewees in New Zealand and Australia, the project funders, and of course the photographers who I constantly steal the images of for my snazzy presentations. Thanks.